August 6, 1945, 9 p.m., Farm Hall, Godmanchester, England. In a grand drawing room that smelled faintly of damp tweed and stale pipe tobacco, the greatest scientific minds of the Third Reich learned they had lost a race they never knew they were running. Major T.H. Rittner, their British custodian, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence, and relayed the 9 o'clock BBC news announcement. A single atomic bomb had been dropped on a Japanese city. Dr. Werner Heisenberg, the Nobel laureate in physics for 1932, froze mid-sentence, his teacup rattling in its saucer, the revelation hitting him not as a strategic blow, but as an impossible scientific absurdity. Werner Heisenberg was a man defined by contradictions, a brilliant theoretical physicist who led Germany's WWII, the Uranium Club, yet possessed a patrician disdain for the gritty work of engineering. A graduate of the University of Munich, in 1923 under the legendary Arnold Sommerfeld, his mind operated on a plane of quantum mechanics and uncertainty principles that few could follow. Even here, interned with 9 other top German scientists, he carried himself with an academic's distracted air, his piercing blue eyes often looking past people as if peering at the subatomic world. His personal habit of restlessly pacing while debating physics was known to all his colleagues, including Otto Hahn, the discoverer of nuclear fission, who now watched him, waiting. For 3 years, from 1942 onward, Heisenberg's primary function had been to determine the feasibility of a uranium bomb, specifically the critical mass of uranium-235, the very core of the weapon he was now told existed. The immediate reaction from the world's leading nuclear physicist was pure, unadulterated disbelief. "I don't believe a word of it," Heisenberg declared, his voice sharp, cutting through the stunned murmurs of his colleagues like Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. He insisted it was a bluff, a colossal piece of Allied propaganda. To him, the physics was simply too demanding. The industrial scale required too vast for any nation to achieve during a full-scale war. The secret Mi-6 microphones hidden in the room's light fixtures, designated Operation Epsilon, recorded the scrape of a chair as physicist Kurt Diebner leaned forward, the tension palpable. The news of a 15-kiloton detonation over Hiroshima wasn't just news of a weapon, it was an indictment of his own scientific judgment. What Heisenberg couldn't possibly fathom was that the Allied effort wasn't a small laboratory project like his own, but a continent-spanning secret civilization built for a single purpose. Overseen by the ruthlessly efficient General Leslie Richard Groves, Jr., a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officer from the West Point class of 1918, and scientifically directed by the enigmatic Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a 1925 Harvard graduate. The Manhattan Engineer District was a $2 billion industrial leviathan. From the moment the Einstein-Szilard letter landed on President Franklin D. Roosevelt's desk on August 2, 1939, the Americans had committed staggering resources. They employed over 130,000 people in 3 secret cities that didn't exist on any map, from the 59,000-acre reservation at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to the vast 586-square-mile plutonium factory at Hanford, Washington. The hum of their machines was a deafening, secret symphony of industrial might, a sound the German team never even imagined. The true American secret, the one that left Heisenberg and his colleagues utterly shattered, wasn't just the bomb's existence, but the sheer, brutal industrial elegance of its creation. It was the simultaneous pursuit of 2 completely separate and redundant paths to a nuclear weapon, the uranium-235 gun-type device and the far more complex plutonium-239 implosion weapon. This dual-track approach, involving thousands of calutron mass spectrometers and the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor, was an engineering feat so far beyond the scope of the Uranium that it might as well have been alien technology. Before I tell you how General Groves and his team of over 130,000 personnel achieved this industrial miracle, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, You won't want to miss the story of how a single calculation by Werner Heisenberg blinded the entire Nazi war machine. By August of 1942, the world wasn't just at war, it was on fire. From the frozen rubble of Stalingrad, where General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army was being bled white, to the depths of the Atlantic, where Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat wolfpacks were strangling the Allied supply lines, the Axis seemed poised on the edge of a dark victory. But a deeper, colder fear haunted the corridors of power in Washington and London. It was a whispered terror, a ghost story told by men like Dr. Vannevar Bush of the OSRD and Harvard President James B. Conant, the specter of a Nazi atomic weapon. 1. The German effort, the *Uranverein*, was a creature of academia, not industry. Led by the brilliant but aloof Dr. Werner Heisenberg, it operated under the Army Ordnance Office, *Heereswaffenamt*, as a collection of competing university labs. Heisenberg, a 1932 Nobel laureate from the University of Munich, was a man whose mind lived in the ethereal world of quantum mechanics, often to the detriment of practical engineering. His team, including rivals like Dr. Kurt Diebner, was fixated on a heavy water-moderated reactor design, pinning their hopes on the output of the Norsk hydro plant in Vemork, Norway. In a fateful report to officials like Albert Speer in June 1942, Heisenberg made a critical error, estimating the critical mass of uranium-235 to be several tons, making a bomb seem a distant, almost impossible project for a nation at war. The air in their labs at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute smelled of old paper and chalk dust, a scent of theory, not of industrial revolution. 2. In stark contrast, the American effort began not with a bang, but with a letter. The warning from Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard that reached President Franklin D. Roosevelt on August 2, 1939, initially sparked a sluggish response. The S-1 Uranium Committee, formed under Dr. Lyman Briggs in October 1939, was given a paltry initial budget of just $6,000. For nearly 2 years, the project remained a small, theoretical exercise. The real catalyst came from across the Atlantic, the British MOD Committee report of March 1941, which landed on Dr. Vannevar Bush's desk that summer. It concluded with chilling certainty that a bomb was possible, with as little as 10 kilograms of U-235, a feasible amount. The quiet hum of university common rooms suddenly gave way to the frantic clatter of teletype machines. 3. Into this whirlwind of scientific urgency stepped a man of concrete and steel. On September 17, 1942, General Leslie Richard Groves, Jr., was given command of the newly formed Manhattan Engineer District. Groves was a large man, over 250 pounds, packed into a standard-issue Class A uniform that always seemed a size too small, his brusque manner legendary within the Army Corps of Engineers. He wasn't a scientist. He was a builder, the man who had just slammed the Pentagon into existence in a record 16 months. His appointment was an unmistakable signal from Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. This was no longer a science fair project. This was war. 4. Groves was a product of the West Point class of 1918, a man haunted by having missed combat in World War I, and driven by a relentless, almost brutal efficiency. His entire career in the Corps of Engineers had been defined by gargantuan construction projects and bureaucratic brawls, preparing him perfectly for a task no one else could comprehend. He viewed the gaggle of eccentric physicists he was about to inherit with deep suspicion, but he understood logistics, supply chains, and, most importantly, authority. Reporting directly to General Marshall and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, Groves wielded near-absolute power. Fueled by an endless supply of chocolate and coffee during his 18-hour workdays, his very first major decision, made on September 18, 1942, was to authorize the purchase of 250 tons of high-grade uranium ore from the Belgian Congo, which had been secretly stored in a warehouse on Staten Island. The weight of that decision was as tangible as the steel girders he was used to commanding. 5. If Groves was the project's iron fist, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer was its incandescent brain. Groves chose him as scientific director in October 1942, a decision that baffled security officials like Colonel John Lansdale, Jr. Oppenheimer was a paradox, a shockingly thin man, often weighing less than 130 pounds, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through you. A constant L&M Chesterfield cigarette dangled from his lips, its smoke a perpetual shroud. A 1925 summa cum laude Harvard graduate who earned his Ph.D. under Max Born and Göttingen by 1927, he was a polymath who read the Bhagavad Gita in its original Sanskrit for solace. His pre-war associations with known communists were a security nightmare, but Groves saw past it, recognizing what he called a genius, with an overweening ambition that could be harnessed for the singular purpose of building the bomb. 6. The strategic situation in late 1942 was terrifyingly grim. While General Dwight D. Eisenhower's forces prepared to storm the beaches of North Africa in Operation Torch on November 8, the Battle of Stalingrad was devolving into a frozen hell that was consuming over 20,000 soldiers per day. In the War Department, planners like General Marshall lived with a constant, gnawing fear. What if Heisenberg was wrong? What if the Germans were closer than anyone knew? A single Nazi atomic bomb could vaporize the Allied beachhead in Morocco, force London to its knees, and end the war. The stakes weren't just victory or defeat. They were survival. 7. This unprecedented project needed a home, a secret place where theory could be forged into a weapon. In late October 1942, Oppenheimer, Groves, and physicist Dr. Ernest O. Lawrence scouted potential sites. They settled on a remote, sun-drenched mesa in the New Mexico wilderness, home to the Los Alamos Ranch School for Boys. On November 16, 1942, Groves approved its acquisition, and it became Site Y. The air there was thin and sharp, smelling of pine and ancient dust. Oppenheimer envisioned it as a scientific crucible, a place where giants like Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, and a young Richard Feynman could debate and design in total isolation. The initial plan called for 30 scientists and their families. Within 2 years, the secret city would swell to over 6,000 residents, every piece of their mail read and censored by a woman named Dorothy McKibben in a dusty office at 109 East Palace Avenue in Santa Fe. 8. While the scientific brain was being assembled, the project's industrial heartlands were being carved out of the American landscape. At Site X, a 59,000-acre tract of Appalachian foothills in eastern Tennessee, the town of Oak Ridge was born. Construction began in early 1943 on 2 competing, colossal technologies for enriching uranium. The first was the Y-12 plant, championed by Dr. Ernest Lawrence. It would house 152 massive Calitron mass spectrometers. The electromagnets for these machines required thousands of tons of copper, a metal so vital to the war effort it was practically unobtainable. In a move of breathtaking audacity, Groves secured approval from Undersecretary of the Treasury Daniel Bell to borrow 14,700 tons of silver from the U.S. Treasury Vault at West Point to wind the magnets. 9. The second uranium path at Oak Ridge was the K-25 plant, a gamble on unproven gaseous diffusion technology on a scale that bordered on madness. Designed by the Kellex Corporation under its president, Percival C. Keith, the main processing building was a single U-shaped structure, half a mile long and 1,000 feet wide, covering 44 acres under one roof. The roar of its construction, which began in June 1943, echoed through the valleys day and night, a deafening symphony of industrial might being unleashed in complete secrecy. 10. But there was another path, a darker and more elegant one, plutonium. This synthetic element, first isolated by Glenn T. Seaborg in February 1941, had to be manufactured atom by atom, inside a nuclear reactor. The proof of concept came on a frigid Chicago afternoon. On December 2, 1942, beneath the abandoned west grandstands of Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, Dr. Enrico Fermi and his team, including the persistent Leo Szilard, achieved the world's first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. Their reactor, Chicago Pile 1, CP1, was a crude-looking 20-foot-tall assembly of 45,000 graphite blocks weighing 360 tons, laced with 5.4 tons of pure uranium metal. At 3:25 p.m., as physicist George Weil withdrew the final cadmium control rod, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic clicking of neutron counters. It was the quietest possible sound for the dawn of the atomic age. 11. Fermi's success with CP1 was the green light for an industrial site dedicated solely to plutonium production. In January 1943, Groves selected a vast, 586-square-mile patch of desolate land along the Columbia River in Washington state, Site W, Hanford. The DuPont Corporation, with its chemical engineering expertise, was brought in under project manager Crawford Greenwalt to build 3 massive production reactors, B, D, and F, and 3 gargantuan, 800-foot-long chemical separation plants nicknamed Queen Marys. The B reactor alone required 2 004 aluminum-canned uranium slugs and would be cooled by 30,000 gallons of filtered river water every single minute. The engineering was on a scale so far beyond the German Uranverein it might as well have been alien technology. 12. While this secret empire of labs and factories was rising from the dirt, the conventional war ground on. Throughout 1943, the skies over Germany grew dark with Allied bombers. RAF Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris and his American counterpart, General Carl Spaatz, were systematically leveling German cities with thousands of tons of high explosives. But the question that kept military planners awake at night remained unanswered. Where was Heisenberg's bomb? Was it hidden in some underground lab? Was it nearly complete? The absolute lack of intelligence was itself a form of psychological torture. 13. To pierce this veil of ignorance, a unique intelligence unit was conceived, the Alsos mission. Its military commander was a man as unusual as the mission itself, Colonel Boris Theodore Pash, a former Hollywood high school PE teacher with a master's degree from USC. Pash had transformed himself into a fanatical and ruthlessly effective counterintelligence officer. With his distinctive bald head, imposing physique, and eyes that burned with patriotic paranoia, he was the man who had investigated Oppenheimer's communist ties in 1943. Now, reporting to Groves, Pash's new function, alongside Chief Scientist Dr. Samuel Goudsmit, was to lead a team of 114 specialists. Their job was to follow the leading edge of the Allied invasion of Europe, set for June 1944, and seize every German scientist, every scrap of data, and every ounce of uranium they could find. 14. By mid-1943, the two sides were set on irrevocably different courses. In Germany, a small, fractured, and underfunded research project, led by the brilliant but impractical Werner Heisenberg, was chasing the dead end of a heavy water reactor, convinced a functional bomb was years away. In America, a secret industrial civilization had been willed into existence. It was a $2 billion leviathan commanded by the indomitable General Leslie Groves, its scientific soul residing in Los Alamos under J. Robert Oppenheimer, and its colossal manufacturing heartlands at Oak Ridge and Hanford, churning out the raw materials of atomic fire. More than 130,000 people were now part of the project, their lives and work hidden behind a wall of secrecy unlike any in history. The gap between the two efforts was no longer just about resources. It was a chasm of vision, will, and industrial power. 15. The secret began to take physical form on a remote desert mesa, a place of stark beauty and profound isolation. On November 16, 1942, General Leslie Groves gave his final, terse approval for Site Y. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer had chosen this spot, the Los Alamos Ranch School, envisioning a scientific utopia where minds like Hans Bethe and Enrico Fermi could work unburdened. But as the first construction crews arrived, the only sounds were the wind whistling through the ponderosa pines and the scrape of their boots on the dry earth. There was no city, no lab, just a promise and a deadline. While Oppenheimer gathered his physicists, Groves unleashed his industrial fury on the Appalachian foothills of Tennessee. The Y-12 plant at Oak Ridge was a monument to brute force, a direct scale-up of Dr. Ernest O. Lawrence's cyclotron concept. It would house 152 Calitron mass spectrometers, each requiring a colossal 184-inch electromagnet. The problem was copper, a metal so critical that every ounce was rationed. So, on August 28, 1942, Groves, in a meeting with Under-Secretary of the Treasury Daniel Bell, made an audacious request. He didn't just ask for a loan. He asked to borrow 14,700 tons of pure silver from the West Point Depository to wind the magnets. The weight of that precious metal was a tangible measure of the project's priority. By early 1943, the ground at Site X shook with the roar of construction, the air thick with the smell of churned red clay and diesel fumes, as 75,000 workers began building a city they couldn't find on any map. Alongside the brute force Calitrons, Groves bet a staggering $500 million on a technology that was, in 1943, little more than a laboratory theory: gaseous diffusion. The K-25 plant, designed by Percival C. Keith of the Kellex Corporation, was an engineering leap into the void. Its main building was a U-shaped behemoth, half a mile long and covering 44 acres, the largest single building on Earth at the time. Inside, thousands of stages of porous nickel barriers, each perforated with billions of microscopic holes per square inch, would separate the lighter U-235 isotope from the highly corrosive uranium hexafluoride, UF6 gas. The sheer scale was nightmarish. Maintaining the vacuum and preventing leaks was a 24/7 battle fought by thousands of operators, most of them young women from the surrounding hills, who knew only that their job was to watch dials and listen for the hiss of a poison gas leak, never knowing they were refining the core of an atomic bomb for Oppenheimer and his lead engineer, Captain William S. Parsons. The project's second, even more secretive path was confirmed in the dead of winter. In a freezing squash court beneath the stands of Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, the atomic age began not with a bang, but with the soft, rhythmic clicking of neutron counters. On December 2, 1942, at 3:25 p.m., Dr. Enrico Fermi, a Nobel laureate from the University of Rome, ordered physicist George Whale to pull the final cadmium control rod. Their reactor, Chicago Pile 1, a 360-ton assembly of graphite and uranium, went critical. Leo Szilard, the man who had first conceived of the chain reaction, watched with a mixture of triumph and terror. This quiet success proved plutonium could be bred in a reactor. With Fermi's proof in hand, Groves immediately tasked the DuPont Corporation with industrializing the process. In January 1943, he selected a 586-square-mile patch of Washington desert for Site W. Hanford. Under the expert eye of project manager Crawford Greenwalt, DuPont began construction on a scale that dwarfed even Oak Ridge. The centerpiece was the B reactor, the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor. It was a 28 by 36-foot graphite cube weighing 200 tons, pierced by two 004 aluminum tubes for the uranium slugs. To cool the inferno within, it would gulp 30,000 gallons of filtered Columbia River water every minute. The site swarmed with over 50,000 workers, their faces caked with dust from the relentless wind, building 3 of these reactors and 3 800-foot-long chemical separation plants, all in less than 24 months. But in the spring of 1944, this plutonium path nearly collapsed. At Los Alamos, physicist Emilio Segre, working with the first microscopic samples of plutonium from a pilot reactor at Oak Ridge, made a horrifying discovery. The reactor-bred plutonium was contaminated with a different isotope, plutonium-240, which had a high rate of spontaneous fission. This contamination meant that a simple gun-type weapon, codenamed Thin Man, would fizzle, pre-detonating before a full-chain reaction could occur. The news hit Oppenheimer like a physical blow. The entire Hanford facility, a $500 million investment, was producing fissile material that was useless for the intended design. The thin, chain-smoking director, his weight dropping below 120 pounds, felt the crushing responsibility for a potential catastrophic failure that could cost the Allies the war. The crisis forced a radical pivot. On July 4, 1944, Oppenheimer made the gut-wrenching decision to abandon the plutonium gun and reorganize the entire Los Alamos laboratory around a wildly theoretical and technically daunting alternative: implosion. The concept, initially proposed by physicist Seth Nettermeyer, was to use conventional high explosives to symmetrically crush a subcritical sphere of plutonium into a supercritical mass. It was a long shot, an engineering nightmare that required a perfection of timing and symmetry that had never been achieved before. The responsibility for making it work was handed to a new division chief, the brilliant and boisterous Harvard chemist George Kistiakowsky. Kistiakowsky, a Ukrainian émigré with a deep love for the precise violence of high explosives, attacked the problem with ferocious energy. His newly formed X division had to solve the puzzle of the explosive lenses. The design they settled on was a sphere composed of 32 precisely machined blocks, 20 hexagons, and 12 pentagons, like a soccer ball, each a composite of fast-burning composition B and slow-burning barytol. The goal was to shape the blast wave, turning it from an expanding explosion into a perfectly focused spherical implosion that would compress the solid plutonium core to twice its density in a few millionths of a second. The canyons around Los Alamos began to echo with daily test explosions, the sharp crack of TNT and the smell of cordite becoming a constant feature of life at Site Y. This mechanical perfection, however, was useless without a nervous system. The 32 lenses had to detonate not just simultaneously, but within a few nanoseconds of each other. This was a challenge for the electronics group, led by the 24-year-old prodigy, Donald Hornig. His team developed exploding bridge wire detonators and, most critically, perfected the *Krytron* switch. This cold cathode gas-filled tube was the secret within the secret, an electronic switch capable of handling 5,000 volts and firing in less than a microsecond. It was the electronic brain that would trigger the bomb's heart. By late 1944, over 500 technicians were dedicated solely to this firing circuit, a level of sophisticated electronic engineering that German scientists like Kurt Diebner, focused on heavy water and mechanical triggers, had never even begun to conceptualize. By the dawn of 1945, the two colossal parallel paths were finally converging on Los Alamos. At Oak Ridge, the Y-12 and K-25 plants were producing the first precious grams of weapons-grade uranium-235. At Hanford, the B reactor, which had gone critical at 10:48 p.m. on September 26, 1944, was transmuting uranium into plutonium around the clock. The raw materials for two different bombs, born from two distinct industrial miracles, were now being shipped in secret convoys to Oppenheimer's scientists. The secret wasn't a single discovery anymore. It was a functioning, continent-spanning weapons system, ready to be assembled. In Berlin, the air in Dr. Werner Heisenberg's laboratory at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was thick, with the scent of chalk dust and stale pipe tobacco. He was utterly convinced of his own conclusions. His 1942 report to the *Heereswaffenamt* had confidently estimated the critical mass of uranium-235 in the tons, a figure that made an atomic bomb a distant fantasy for a nation fighting on two fronts. This single catastrophic miscalculation, born of theoretical elegance rather than practical rigor, became the cornerstone of Germany's nuclear ignorance. For officials like Albert Speer, it was a settled matter. 1. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, under the weary and increasingly disillusioned Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, was looking for a ghost of its own making. Their agents in the United States, operating under intense FBI counterintelligence pressure, were tasked with finding evidence of an Allied bomb project. But their search parameters, dictated by the German experience, were hopelessly flawed. They looked for a single, heavily guarded research institute, perhaps a pilot reactor similar to the one Heisenberg was trying to build in a cave in Haigerloch. On November 23, 1943, an Abwehr report concluded there was no evidence of a large-scale American program. They couldn't find it because they couldn't conceive of it. They were searching for a laboratory, and the Allies had built a secret continent. 2. The true shield of the secret was a system of human walls, a philosophy of absolute compartmentalization ruthlessly enforced by General Leslie Groves. A young woman from rural Tennessee, one of 75,000 workers at Oak Ridge, might spend a 12-hour shift watching a single dial, number 273 on a panel of hundreds, her only job to report if it flickered into the red. She didn't know the hissing sound behind the wall was corrosive uranium hexafluoride gas, or that her work was separating U-235. At Los Alamos, a security force of over 485 military police monitored every conversation, while a woman named Dorothy McKibben censored every piece of mail from a dusty office in Santa Fe. The project was a mosaic of over 130,000 individual pieces of ignorance, with only Groves and a handful of others, like his Deputy General Thomas Farrell, ever seeing the full, terrifying picture. The only smell was that of duty, sweat, and secrecy. 3. In the frozen skies over Germany in early 1945, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a 24-year-old pilot flying a Messerschmitt Me 262 jet, banked over the cloud cover. His reconnaissance photos showed strange, sprawling construction in remote parts of Washington and Tennessee, patterns that didn't match any known munitions plant. But his reports, filed with the staff of General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, were dismissed. The scale was simply too vast, the logistics too impossible to be a single, secret project. It was interpreted as just another sign of America's overwhelming conventional industrial might, a conclusion that was tragically, fundamentally wrong. 4. This German misconception was actively nurtured by Allied actions. The most brilliant piece of misdirection was Operation Gunnerside. On the night of February 28, 1943, a team of 11 Norwegian commandos led by Joachim Ronneberg successfully sabotaged the Norsk Hydro heavy water production facility at Vemork, Norway. To the German High Command, this daring raid confirmed that the Allies' greatest fear was their heavy water reactor program. It focused their attention, and their limited resources, on defending the very path that was a technological dead end. It was the perfect feint, making the German war machine look left, while the true threat, the 200-ton graphite-moderated B reactor at Hanford, was rising on their right. 5. The German effort was also eating itself from within, poisoned by the professional jealousies of its top scientists. Dr. Werner Heisenberg, the celebrated Nobel laureate from the University of Munich, favored a design using uranium plates submerged in heavy water. His chief rival, Dr. Kurt Diebner, a more practical physicist working for Army Ordnance, argued for a superior lattice of uranium cubes. Diebner's experiments at Gotto, particularly the LIV reactor, which used 6 800 uranium oxide cubes, were actually more promising. But Heisenberg's academic prestige won out, and the program's resources were split and squandered. These internal squabbles, documented in memos to the Reich Research Council under Walther Gerlach, ensured the *Uranverein* never achieved the critical mass of talent and unity that Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer was forging through sheer force of will at Los Alamos, where the only sound that mattered was the collective hum of 6,000 minds focused on a single problem. 6. While German physicists debated theory, the American secret was becoming a physical reality with terrifying speed. At Oak Ridge, the Y-12 plant's 152 calatrons were humming with a power that made the concrete floor vibrate. By mid-1944, under the watchful eye of Dr. Ernest O. Lawrence, these machines, their massive electromagnets wound with 14,700 tons of borrowed U.S. Treasury silver, were producing the first precious grams of weapons-grade uranium-235. This was a secret, measured not in reports, but in the steadily growing weight of a metal that could end the war. 7. The enemy's final, desperate attempts to collaborate were tragically futile. In the last days of the European War, the German submarine U-234 set sail for Japan. Its cargo, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Johann Heinrich Fehler, included advanced jet engine plans, radar systems, and, most tellingly, 560 kilograms of uranium oxide in 10 lead-lined cases. The uranium was destined for Japan's own fledgling atomic program, a project so far behind it was practically non-existent. When U-234 surrendered to the U.S. Sutton on May 14, 1945, its cargo provided Allied intelligence with a final, definitive piece of evidence. The Axis powers were still thinking in terms of lab supplies, while the Hanford site was now capable of producing that much plutonium in a matter of weeks. 8. Perhaps the most effective cloak of all was the sheer, mind-numbing banality of the project's official name, the Manhattan Engineer District, a designation created on August 13, 1942, sounded like a bureaucratic backwater responsible for dredging rivers or building depots. No foreign intelligence service, not even the meticulous German Abwehr would ever flag it for high-level scrutiny. General Groves, a man who preferred a simple Hershey's chocolate bar to any delicacy, understood bureaucratic camouflage better than anyone. He hid his $2 billion sword in a haystack of paperwork. 9. Imagine being Hauptmann Dieter Vogel, an intelligence analyst for the RSHA in a cold Berlin office in January 1945. The room smells of ersatz coffee and damp wool. He is staring at charts showing massive, inexplicable spikes in electricity consumption from the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Bonneville Power Administration in the American Northwest. He sees enormous, priority requisitions for thousands of tons of graphite of a purity never before seen, and miles of specialized nickel piping. But the data is too big, too scattered. It points everywhere and nowhere. His superiors, like sulfur monosulfide Brigadeführer Walter Schellenberg, conclude it's just evidence of America's brute force production of tanks and planes. Their final report, dated January 15, 1945, states that America's conventional industrial output exceeds Germany's by a factor of 10. They saw the beast's shadow, but they couldn't possibly imagine its shape. 10. The project's greatest unwitting shield was the scientific arrogance of its target. Werner Heisenberg was a titan of theoretical physics, a man who could feel the strange dance of quantum mechanics in his bones. But this same genius bred a patrician contempt for the messy, practical work of engineering. In his pivotal June 4, 1942, meeting with Armaments Minister Albert Speer, he dismissed the idea of a bomb being built during the war. This single, confident assessment, delivered with the unimpeachable authority of a Nobel laureate, was a death sentence for the German project. It relegated the *Uranverein* to a low-priority research effort, starving it of the very resources Groves was commanding by the trainload. 11. As Heisenberg theorized, a new kind of physics was being brutally engineered in the high desert of New Mexico. The sharp, violent crack of high explosives became the daily heartbeat of Los Alamos. George Kistiakowsky's X Division was perfecting the implosion device, conducting hundreds of test shots in the surrounding canyons. On May 7, 1945, they detonated a 100-ton sphere of TNT to calibrate their instruments, a blast that rattled windows 50 miles away. It was a sound that announced the birth of a new god of war, a sound no enemy intelligence ever registered. 12. The secret was so tightly held that even the Allied high command was kept in darkness. Five-star generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower and fleet admirals like Chester W. Nimitz were only briefed in the spring of 1945 on the existence of a new weapon of unusual destructive force. The details were withheld. Even Harry S. Truman, Vice President of the United States, knew nothing. It wasn't until 12 days after Franklin Roosevelt's death, on April 25, 1945, that Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, a 77-year-old statesman whose face was etched with the gravity of his knowledge, finally sat the new president down and revealed the full, terrifying scope of the Manhattan Project. The secret was so profound, it was a ghost, even within its own government, a testament to General Groves' obsessive, compartmentalized control. 13. This total ignorance had a direct strategic impact on the war's final act. The Japanese military leadership, reeling from the devastating firebombing raids of General Curtis LeMay's B-29s, braced for a conventional invasion. War Minister Korechika Anami and Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki planned for Operation Ketsugo, the final defense of the home islands, believing the war would climax in a bloody attritional battle on their beaches. Their intelligence saw the massing of Allied ships and troops, but they never saw the real threat. They couldn't imagine that the work of the 334 bombers that immolated Tokyo on March 10, 1945, could soon be done by a single plane carrying a single bomb. 14. In the end, the enemy remained blind because the truth was simply beyond their imagination. Dr. Heisenberg, pacing the floor of his German laboratory, could not conceive of a project run by a man like General Groves, a blunt engineer who measured progress in cubic yards of concrete and megawatts of power. The German scientists were trying to solve a physics problem. The Manhattan Project had solved an industrial one. The secret wasn't a formula on a blackboard. It was a civilization, and its existence was the ultimate unspoken weapon. 15. By the spring of 1944, the secret was threatening to eat itself alive. At Los Alamos, physicist Emilio Segre, a protege of Enrico Fermi, was analyzing the first microscopic samples of plutonium from the X-10 pilot reactor at Oak Ridge. His instruments, more sensitive than any before them, delivered a gut-punch discovery in March 1944. The reactor-bred plutonium was contaminated with plutonium-240, an isotope with a spontaneous fission rate over 17,000 times higher than expected. The cold dread that filled the lab was palpable. The $500 million Hanford reactors were about to produce tons of fissile material that was utterly useless for their planned Thin Man gun-type bomb. The news hit Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer with the force of a physical blow. The entire plutonium path, the elegant alternative to the brute force uranium enrichment, was on the verge of catastrophic failure. On July 4, 1944, Oppenheimer, his weight dropping below 120 pounds and his L&M Chesterfield cigarettes burning down to his knuckles, made a decision of breathtaking risk. He abandoned the plutonium gun and reorganized the entire laboratory around a wildly theoretical concept: implosion. He created a new X Division and placed it under the command of George Kistiakowsky, a boisterous Harvard chemist and explosives expert. Kistiakowsky, a Ukrainian immigrant who had fled the Bolsheviks, attacked the problem with a manic energy, his lab notebooks filled with precise, violent calculations. His team had to perfect a sphere of 32 explosive lenses, 20 hexagons and 12 pentagons, made of fast-burning composition B and slow-burning barytol, designed to create a perfectly symmetrical shockwave. The sharpest crack of their daily test explosions began to echo through Pajorito Canyon, The smell of cordite a constant reminder that they were racing against not just the Germans but their own flawed physics. This mechanical perfection was nothing without an electronic nervous system capable of impossible speed. The task fell to the 24-year-old electronics prodigy Donald Hornig and his team in E5 Group. They had to ensure all 32 explosive lenses detonated within a few billionths of a second of each other. The solution was a technological leap: exploding bridge wire detonators triggered by a high-voltage discharge from massive capacitors. The key component, the secret within the secret, was the Krytron switch, a cold cathode gas-filled tube capable of handling a 5,000-volt pulse and firing in less than a microsecond. By late 1944, over 500 technicians were working around the clock just on this firing circuit, the faint smell of ozone from their high-voltage test benches a constant presence in the tech area. This was a level of electronic sophistication that German scientists like Kurt Diebner, still focused on mechanical triggers, hadn't even begun to imagine. While Los Alamos reinvented itself, the project's industrial heartland finally hit its stride. By October 1944, the Y-12 plant at Oak Ridge, under the meticulous supervision of Dr. Ernest O. Lawrence, was producing nearly 200 grams of weapons-grade U-235 per day. Its 152 calutrons, their magnets wound with 14,700 tons of borrowed treasury silver, hummed with a power that made the concrete floor vibrate ceaselessly. This steady output, a direct result of solving countless engineering hurdles, ensured that even if the plutonium gadget failed, the United States would still possess at least one functional atomic weapon by the summer of 1945. This growing certainty was bolstered by intelligence from the front lines. Following the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, Colonel Boris Pash and the Alsos mission began their hunt. Pash, a man whose bald head and burning eyes radiated a fanatical intensity, led his 114 specialists into newly liberated territory, their jeeps often getting ahead of the main army. In November 1944, at the University of Strasbourg, also scientist Dr. Samuel Goudsmit uncovered a trove of documents belonging to Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. The papers, smelling of damp cellar mold and old ink, were a revelation. They proved definitively that the German Uran-Verein was years behind, still struggling with basic reactor design and possessing no industrial infrastructure. This intelligence, relayed directly to General Leslie Groves, was a massive strategic victory. It saved untold resources, as Allied planners like General George C. Marshall no longer had to hedge their bets against a surprise German nuclear attack, freeing up at least 2 full infantry divisions that had been held in reserve in England. The direct tactical impact of this intelligence was felt just 1 month later. When Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt launched his massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, the Allies were caught completely by surprise. The port of Antwerp, with its docks piled high with over 500,000 tons of Allied supplies, was a prime target. Without the Alsos mission's confirmation that no German atomic device existed, General Dwight D. Eisenhower would have been forced to disperse these supplies and evacuate the city, a logistical nightmare that would have crippled the Allied response and potentially cost over 20,000 additional lives. Instead, confident that the only threat was conventional, he could focus all his resources on containing the German breakthrough in the biting cold of the Belgian winter. Meanwhile, in the Washington desert, the second path to the bomb was roaring to life. The massive B reactor at Hanford, managed by DuPont's Crawford Greenwald, had gone critical at 10:48 p.m. on September 26, 1944. After overcoming a brief but terrifying shutdown due to neutron poisoning from xenon-135, it began churning out plutonium. By February 1945, the first hockey puck-sized buttons of the silvery man-made metal were being produced. Each one was warm to the touch from its own radioactivity. Secret couriers, like the unassuming agent George Graves, would transport the plutonium cores in lead-lined suitcases on nondescript passenger trains. The weight of the case, a constant, heavy reminder of its apocalyptic potential. The arrival of these fissile materials transformed Los Alamos from a theoretical laboratory into a frantic weapons factory. By the spring of 1945, the tension was a physical presence, the air thick with the smell of machine oil, solder, and the nervous sweat of 6,000 people working against an unbreakable deadline. Oppenheimer, now a skeletal figure weighing barely 115 pounds, seemed to be everywhere at once, his piercing blue eyes checking the work of the G Division, Gadget Division, under Robert Bacher, as they practiced the delicate, dangerous assembly of the plutonium core. This intense, focused effort compressed what should have been 5 years of development into just 12 months, a time-saving advantage that would prove decisive as the casualty projections for the invasion of Japan mounted. This furious secret evolution occurred against a backdrop of total enemy ignorance. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters, under the direction of War Minister Korechika Onami, was finalizing the plans for Operation Ketsugo, the final defense of the home islands. Their strategy was based on a single, flawed assumption that America's will would break after suffering the 1 million casualties their analysts predicted for an invasion. Their intelligence officers, like Lieutenant General Seizo Arisu, saw the massing of Allied ships and B-29s, but they never saw the real weapon. This failure to comprehend the true nature of the threat was a direct result of the Manhattan Project's security, a strategic advantage that would ultimately save the very lives the Japanese were counting on the Allies to lose. By June of 1945, the secret was no longer a theory or a blueprint. It had evolved into two distinct, terrifyingly real pieces of hardware. The first was the Little Boy, a 700-pound gun-type device whose uranium-235 core was considered so reliable by its chief engineer, Captain William S. Parsons, that it wouldn't even require a full-scale test. The second was the Fat Man, a complex 800-pound sphere of high explosives and plutonium, a weapon of such alien complexity that its creators had to be certain it would work. The secret was now a physical object, being prepared for a final, cataclysmic dress rehearsal in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, a test, code-named Trinity. February 24, 1992, the Public Record Office, Kew, London. In a quiet, climate-controlled reading room that smelled of aging paper and archival dust, the final secret of the Second World War finally gave up its ghost. Sir Charles Frank, a retired British physicist who had worked on the wartime intelligence operation, adjusted his spectacles, his hand trembling slightly, as he reviewed the newly declassified file WO 208-5019. It was the complete, unredacted transcript of Operation Epsilon. For nearly 47 years, the words spoken by Germany's 10 most brilliant intern scientists had been a state secret, but now, on these brittle yellowed pages, the full, devastating truth of their failure was laid bare. For almost half a century, the Farm Hall recordings remained one of the British government's most sensitive secrets, locked away under the Official Secrets Act. The long, arduous process of declassification was the result of years of pressure from historians like Dr. Margaret Gowing, the official historian of the UK Atomic Energy Authority. Finally, after a review by MI6 and the Cabinet Office under Prime Minister John Major, the files were released. The documents themselves were a time capsule, over 250 pages of verbatim dialogue, painstakingly transcribed from recordings made by 12 hidden microphones powered by a 12-volt battery system. They captured every sigh, every argument, every moment of dawning horror among men, like Werner Heisenberg and Otto Hahn, as they learned of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The transcripts were a historical bombshell. They provided a raw, unfiltered window into the minds of the German Uranverein. The most damning section was the recording from the night of August 6th. Heisenberg's immediate, arrogant dismissal, "I don't believe a word of it," was followed by his colleagues goading him into explaining how a bomb could work. In a single evening lecture, he frantically recalculated the critical mass of U-235, arriving at a figure in the kilograms, a calculation he had failed to make correctly for over 3 years, having previously estimated it in the tons. This single conversation proved what Allied intelligence, led by men like Colonel Boris Pash, had suspected but could not know for sure. The brilliant Heisenberg had been catastrophically wrong about the fundamental physics of his own project. The release sent immediate shockwaves through the global community of physicists and historians. The prevailing post-war narrative, a myth carefully constructed by Heisenberg himself in post-war interviews and his 1956 book No Just Tricks in Philosophy, was that the German scientists had known how to build a bomb, but had deliberately slow-walked the project for moral reasons. The transcripts vaporized this self-serving legend. Historians like Dr. Jeremy Bernstein and Dr. Paul Lawrence Rose seized on the documents, recognizing them as the Rosetta Stone of the German nuclear program. The conversations revealed a project crippled by professional rivalries, a stunning ignorance of engineering principles, and a fatal underestimation of their enemy. The new evidence completely rewrote our understanding of the so-called atomic race. The tapes revealed a program that was not just behind, but wasn't even on the same track. The German scientists, including the Nobel laureate Otto Hahn, expressed utter disbelief that the Allies could separate U-235 on an industrial scale, let alone conceive of and manufacture plutonium. In a moment of raw confrontation recorded on the night of August 6th, Hahn told a distraught Heisenberg, "If you are right, you're second-raters." The revelation wasn't that the Germans had failed to build a bomb. It was that they didn't even possess the basic conceptual framework to understand how the Americans had succeeded. More than anything, the transcripts provided the ultimate, delayed vindication for the scale and secrecy of the Manhattan Project. The German scientists' awestruck guesses at the project's cost, $2 billion, one exclaimed, and its manpower, Heisenberg himself estimated 180,000 workers, were astonishingly close to the real figures of $1.9 billion and 130,000 personnel. Their incredulity was the final testament to General Leslie Groves's achievement. This new evidence confirmed that the race was a phantom chase. The United States had built a secret industrial civilization to fight a specter of German scientific superiority, a specter that, as the tapes proved, was a hollow ghost. The weight of the responsibility carried by Groves and Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer suddenly seemed even heavier, and their success even more miraculous. For the few surviving veterans of the Manhattan Project, men like Donald Hornig, who had designed the Krytron firing circuits for the implosion bomb, the news was a quiet, profound validation. For decades, they had lived with the complex moral burden of having created and used the ultimate weapon. The transcripts proved that their work, undertaken in the terrifying belief that they were racing against a Nazi bomb, was based on a legitimate fear. The confirmation that the German program was not a moral objector, but a scientific failure, reinforced the brutal necessity of their own desperate, unprecedented effort. The ghost they had been chasing may have been smaller than they feared, but it had been very, very real. Within 2 years, the historical landscape had been irrevocably altered. Dr. Bernstein's 1995 book, Hitler's Uranium Club, The Secret Recordings at Farm Hall, became the definitive work on the subject, meticulously dissecting the scientific errors and personal dynamics revealed in the transcripts. Academic journals, including the Asterisk Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, published dozens of papers analyzing the new data. The official narrative, which had held for nearly 50 years, was officially dead. It was replaced by a more complex and humbling truth that scientific genius, without industrial will, engineering prowess, and unified purpose, was ultimately powerless. The Farm Hall transcripts were more than a historical correction. They were an echo from a gilded cage, a ghost story told by the scientists themselves. The sound of their disbelief, their envy, and their dawning comprehension of their own irrelevance, captured on primitive magnetic wire, hidden in the picture rails of a British country home, was the final, delayed report from the front lines of the scientific war. It was the sound of an entire establishment confronting its own failure. For 47 years, the secret had been the existence of the American bomb. The final revelation was the true reason for the German failure. Ultimately, the declassification of file WO208 5019 didn't just add a footnote to the history of the Second World War, it rewrote a central chapter. It explained with chilling clarity why the Alsos mission found only a primitive experimental reactor in a Haigerloch cave in April 1945. It clarified that the true, unbreachable secret of the Manhattan Project was never a single formula, but an industrial philosophy. The narrative shifted forever from a race of geniuses to a story of industrial will versus academic hubris, a lesson that would echo through the entire Cold War. The wake of the Farm Hall revelations in February 1992 was less a single wave than a seismic shift that permanently altered the bedrock of World War II history. The self-serving myth of Werner Heisenberg's moral resistance, a narrative he and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker had carefully cultivated for nearly 50 years, was shattered by the sound of their own voices captured on MI6's 12 hidden microphones. Historians like Dr. Jeremy Bernstein and Dr. David C. Cassidy immediately began the work of dismantling the old fiction, culminating in definitive works like Bernstein's 1995 book, Time Times Hitler's Uranium Club. The history books were rewritten, no longer telling a story of a close race between geniuses, but of a phantom chase where one side had built a secret industrial civilization, while the other couldn't even get the basic math right. The sound of this historical correction was the quiet rustle of thousands of pages being revised in archives and libraries around the world, a silent testament to a secret finally told. The legacy of the Manhattan Project echoed far beyond the history books, becoming a blueprint for the military-industrial complexes that would define the Cold War. The project's dual-path approach, simultaneously developing the Y-12 calutrons and the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, and pursuing both uranium and plutonium weapons, became the gold standard for high-stakes, state-sponsored technological development, a strategy of engineered redundancy still used by agencies like NASA and the Department of Defense. On a micro level, technologies like Donald Hornig's Krytron switch, the cold cathode tube designed to handle a 5,000-volt pulse in under a microsecond, became a critical component in countless high-speed electronic applications for the next 40 years. For the project's leaders, General Leslie Groves and Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, history's judgment became more complex. Groves, the builder, was lauded for his unparalleled organizational genius, while Oppenheimer, the creator, would be haunted by his creation, his security clearance revoked in a controversial 1954 hearing, a stark reminder of the political suspicion that often follows monumental achievement. The air in the new national labs, like Lawrence Livermore, crackled with the energy of this complex legacy. Today, the secret cities of the Manhattan Project have been brought out of the shadows. On November 10, 2015, Secretary of the Interior Sally Jewell officially established the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, preserving key facilities at the three sites of Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. At Hanford, you can now tour the B reactor, its 36-foot-tall graphite, face a silent, imposing monument, the two 004 aluminum process tubes, empty but still radiating a sense of immense power. The wind whistles through the now demolished footprint of the K-25 plant in Tennessee, a space so vast it's hard to imagine the roar of the 75,000 workers who once filled it. These sites are no longer black holes on a map, but places of pilgrimage and reflection, their quiet halls and empty fields, a stark contrast to the thunderous, secret work that once shook the very ground they stand on. This historical preservation brought with it a late but deeply felt recognition for the 130,000 men and women who worked on the project, most in total ignorance of their ultimate purpose. While top scientists like Vannevar Bush and James B. Conant received the Presidential Medal for Merit from President Harry S. Truman as early as 1948, the vast majority of workers received little more than a form letter. The creation of the park, along with numerous documentary films and oral history projects, finally honored their contribution. This acknowledgement reinforces the brutal calculus that haunted Truman and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. The use of two bombs, built with 64 kilograms of U-235 and 6.2 kilograms of Pu-239 respectively, prevented Operation Downfall, an invasion projected to cost over 1 million Allied casualties and at least 4 million Japanese lives. The weight of that decision is still felt, as tangible as a posthumously awarded medal resting in a grandchild's hand. Inside the preserved control room of the B reactor at Hanford, the air is still and cool, carrying the faint metallic scent of a machine long asleep. All 36 of the cadmium control rods, once manipulated with micrometer precision by operators under the guidance of DuPont's Crawford Greenwalt, are fully inserted, the reactor's heart permanently stilled. On a guided tour, a park ranger might point to the exact spot where, at 10:48 p.m. on September 26, 1944, the hum of the cooling pumps and the clicking of neutron counters first signaled that humanity had industrialized the heart of a star. A single shaft of Washington sunlight cuts through a high window, glinting off the polished brass caps of the process tubes that line the reactor's face. In this profound silence, one can almost feel the ghost of the machine's former life, a silent, 200-ton titan that once roared with the power of 30,000 gallons of river water a minute, forging the element that would end a world war and cast a shadow over all the decades to come.